Ancient Egypt is not a forgotten civilization. It is one of the most extensively studied societies in human history. We have names, chronologies, dynasties, texts, and monuments that have been examined for generations. And yet, there are aspects of ancient Egypt that remain difficult to explain fully. Not because they are mythical, not because they are symbolic, but because, in certain cases, the evidence does not fit neatly into the models we usually rely on. This video is not about hidden answers. It is not about forbidden truths. It is about questions that continue to exist within academic discussion. And perhaps the most important point is this: the more carefully Egypt is studied, the more complex, and in some areas, incomplete, the picture becomes. Tonight, we are not trying to solve ancient Egypt. We are examining what still invites debate. Before we begin, take a moment to ground yourself here. Let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now for you? Some of you are watching this late at night. Some early in the morning. Some while the world around you is quiet. However you found your way here, you're welcome. If this kind of slow, thoughtful history is something you enjoy, you might want to stay. This channel is dedicated to long-form explorations like this. Calm, detailed, and designed to let you think while you listen. If that sounds like your kind of space, consider subscribing. Now, let's return to ancient Egypt. Most civilizations appear to follow patterns that archaeologists recognize well. Gradual development, experimentation, adjustment over time. Ancient Egypt does not appear to follow that pattern consistently in every respect. In some areas, it seems to emerge already structured, organized, consistent, and confident in its systems. This observation has led researchers to ask careful but important questions. For much of modern scholarship, ancient Egypt was considered relatively well understood. Its timeline was outlined, its rulers identified, its belief systems categorized. Or at least, that was the assumption. As archaeological methods improved, and as sites were re-examined with new tools, something unexpected began to happen. New discoveries did not simply clarify details. In several cases, they complicated the narrative. Based on comparative archaeology, early stages of civilization are usually modest. Tools evolve slowly. Architecture becomes refined over time. Administrative systems mature gradually. However, some of Egypt's earliest major remains already display a high degree of planning, precision, consistency, and standardized methods. Many researchers have noted that this level of organization appears earlier than comparative models would predict. Not impossible, but worth examining carefully. In most regions, progress leaves visible transitions, rough versions, incremental improvements, clear learning curves. In ancient Egypt, some of the most impressive achievements appear very early in the record. Later periods often maintain these standards, rather than significantly surpassing them. This pattern has been discussed extensively within mainstream Egyptological scholarship. It raises questions, not conclusions. Consider the range of knowledge present in early Egypt. Geometric principles apply to large-scale construction. Architectural alignment with remarkable consistency. Medical practices that extend beyond basic survival. astronomical observation tied to long-term cycles. None of these elements are mysterious on their own. What draws attention is how early they appear. In organized, repeatable form. Many scholars point out that such consistency usually reflects long-standing traditions of learning, which leads to a reasonable question. If knowledge typically develops through stages, where are all the earlier stages? Some may simply not have survived. Others may still be undiscovered. Researchers openly acknowledge this uncertainty. The issue is not that explanations do not exist, but that some remain incomplete. Archaeology excels at identifying what existed, explaining how certain systems became established so quickly is more challenging, especially when similar developments in other regions required much longer periods. This does not invalidate existing historical models. It invites refinement. Standardization implies training, knowledge transmission, and shared methods. Many Egyptologists have emphasized how early Egyptian systems appear standardized. This observation exists within academic literature. It is discussed cautiously, but consistently. Historical timelines are often simplified. For clarity, Egypt's timeline appears notably coherent. Long dynasties, defined religious frameworks, strong continuity across centuries. Some scholars have suggested that this smoothness may obscure periods we understand less clearly. This perspective is not controversial. It is openly acknowledged in research. Within Egyptology, there is broad agreement on one point. There are gaps, transitional phases that remain debated, developments that are still being examined, origins that invite further study. These are not fringe ideas. They are part of an ongoing scholarly conversation. This series does not argue against history. It works within it. By slowing down, by questioning carefully, by acknowledging uncertainty where it exists. Because history is not weakened by questions. It is strengthened by them. Ancient Egypt does not challenge us because it lacks evidence. It challenges us because some evidence resists easy explanation. And next, we will turn to the structures themselves. Not to question whether they exist, but to examine why certain features continue to raise discussion among researchers. Now that we've stepped back and acknowledged what we still debate, it becomes possible to look more closely at what remains physically in front of us. Not as symbols, not as myths, but as structures. Because whatever questions surround ancient Egypt, its architecture is not theoretical. It exists. Massive stone blocks, placed, aligned, and repeated with a level of consistency that invites careful attention. This is where many discussions begin, and where they often go wrong. The question is usually framed as, how could people that early have built something like this? But that framing assumes something that is not actually required. Ancient Egyptians were capable builders. They had time. They had organization. They had labor. The mystery is not that these structures were built. The more interesting question is different. Why were they built this way? Consider the scale. Individual blocks weighing several tons are not unusual in ancient construction. What stands out in Egypt is not the presence of large stones, but their repetition, again and again, across multiple sites, across long periods of time. This suggests planning that extends beyond isolated projects. It suggests a standardized approach to monumental construction. Precision matters here. Not perfection, but consistency. stone faces that meet with minimal variation, courses that remain level over long distances, alignments that repeat even when they are not structurally necessary. These are choices, and choices reflect priorities. In many early societies, construction begins rough. Foundations shift. Techniques evolve visibly. Later buildings improve on earlier attempts. In Egypt, some of the earliest large-scale structures already exhibit a refined method. Later periods often maintain these standards, rather than dramatically improving upon them. That pattern deserves attention, not because it defies physics, but because it defies expectation. One area where this becomes especially noticeable is material handling. Moving stone is not mysterious. Dragging heavy loads with coordinated labor is well documented across cultures. What draws interest in Egypt is how early this process appears systematized. The use of consistent block dimensions, repeatable transport methods, established work rhythms. This implies experience. Experience is not created instantly. It accumulates, which leads back to a recurring theme. If these methods appear early, they may reflect practices that predate the monuments themselves. That possibility does not rewrite history. It simply extends it. Another aspect frequently discussed is erosion, not as proof of anything singular, but as a data point. Certain surfaces display wear that differs from surrounding stone. In some cases, patterns resemble long-term exposure to water, rather than wind and sand alone. This observation has been debated extensively. Some interpretations are challenged. Others remain under review. What matters is not reaching a verdict, but recognizing that the discussion exists. These are not fringe conversations. They appear in peer-reviewed contexts. They are revisited as new data becomes available, which is how archaeology is supposed to work. Dating is another area where simplicity breaks down. Structures are often assigned dates based on surrounding materials, historical records, or associated artifacts. These methods are sound, but they are not infallible. A structure can be reused, modified, built upon. Stone does not carry a timestamp. This means some elements may be older than the cultural layer that surrounds them. Again, not a conclusion, a consideration. One of the most revealing questions is rarely asked directly. If these construction methods were so effective, so repeatable, and so well understood, why do we later see changes? Not improvements, but simplifications. Smaller blocks, less precise joins, reduced emphasis on alignment. This is not regression. It is adaptation. But it raises an important point. The story of Egyptian architecture is not one of continuous escalation. It is one of early mastery followed by variation, which challenges a common assumption. We often imagine progress as a straight line. Egypt suggests something different. That advanced techniques can emerge early, be maintained for long periods, and later be set aside for reasons unrelated to capability. Economics, politics, religion. Priorities change. And when priorities change, methods change with them. This reframes the discussion entirely. The mystery isn't how they built it. The mystery is why they stopped building like this. And that question does not accuse the past. It respects it enough to take it seriously. What we see in stone is not an impossibility. It is evidence of decisions made within a context. We are still working to understand. And this brings us to a deeper issue. Structures do not exist in isolation. They are products of systems. Systems of knowledge. Systems of organization. Systems of transmission. Which means that to understand the buildings, we must look beyond the stone and toward the chapters of history that may no longer be fully visible. That is where the next part begins. There is a moment in the study of ancient Egypt where the evidence does something unexpected. Not by contradicting itself or collapsing under scrutiny, and not by pointing toward mystery or spectacle, but by becoming quieter, thinner, and less responsive than we anticipate. This quiet is not absence. And it is not erasure. It is a form of silence. A condition where information still exists, but in a reduced density compared to what comes before and after it. That distinction matters, because much of how we reconstruct early history depends not only on what once existed, but on what survived well enough to be detected by our tools. In most regions of the ancient world, early development leaves behind a visibly gradual trail. We see small beginnings, incremental complexity, experimentation that sometimes fails, sometimes succeeds, and slowly matures into stable systems. That kind of development leaves debris. And debris is archaeologically generous. Egypt's early story often feels different. Not because development did not occur, but because what survives already appears confident, coherent, and internally organized. This can create the impression that Egyptian civilization steps onto the historical stage already prepared, already functioning, rather than visibly forming. That impression has been discussed quietly in academic circles for decades. And it does not suggest sudden appearance, but selective visibility. A useful example appears during the Naqada period, before Egypt's dynasties were formally established. Here, archaeological evidence already points toward emerging social hierarchy, symbolic continuity, and planned burial practices that imply coordination beyond isolated communities. This does not mean that Egyptian society was fully developed at this stage, but it does suggest that organizational thinking was already underway, before later monumental expressions made it unmistakable. Transitions are usually where history reveals itself most clearly. Political change, religious shifts, and technological adaptation tend to leave marks that are easy to trace. Yet in Egypt, some transitions feel unusually smooth. Dynasties change, but administrative logic continues. Religious concepts evolve, but core principles remain recognizable. Architectural emphasis shifts, yet foundational planning strategies persist. This continuity is often celebrated as evidence of extraordinary stability. And in many ways, it is. But stability has a side effect. It can conceal earlier complexity. When a system works, it does not announce its origins loudly. It repeats. It standardizes. And it preserves itself. Earlier, less stable experiments may vanish without leaving strong traces. Not because they never existed, but because they were not protected in the same way. This is where modern assumptions can quietly mislead us. We often imagine progress as something that must leave visible steps behind. But history does not always behave that way. Some of the most durable systems are also the least archaeologically dramatic. Because once refined, they no longer need to change visibly. It is important to be clear about the limits of what we know. We do not lack understanding of early Egypt because knowledge never existed, but because our tools are far better at detecting stone than process, far better at recording outcomes than transmission. This is a limitation of method, not a failure of history. Egypt presents a particular challenge because its later clarity casts a shadow backward. We see finished architecture, established cosmology, and standardized administration. But the quieter stages, the planning, the negotiation, and the refinement, are harder to isolate. These stages are not missing. They are simply less preserved. Geography plays a role here as well. The Nile floods annually. Land is reused rather than abandoned. Settlements rebuild instead of relocating. And materials are recycled rather than discarded. Continuity preserves systems, but it erases some of their earliest footprints. This does not point toward lost civilizations or secret knowledge. It points toward longevity. And longevity complicates archaeology. When we look at Egyptian architecture across time, we do not see a straight line of escalation. We see variation, simplification, and adaptation. Smaller blocks, less precise joins, and reduced emphasis on alignment. These appear not because capability was lost, but because priorities changed. Economics shift. Political structures evolve. Religious needs transform. And when priorities change, methods change with them. This is not regression. It is response. Which brings us to a deeper realization. Structures do not exist in isolation. They are expressions of systems. Systems of knowledge. Systems of organization. And systems of transmission. Stone is the result, not the process. And processes are far easier to lose than monuments. What challenges us about ancient Egypt is not that it lacks evidence, but that some of its most important evidence does not behave the way we expect it to. Not because history is hiding something, but because we are still learning how to listen to what remains. And that brings us naturally to the next question. If knowledge circulated before it was monumental, if systems existed before they were carved into stone, then what kind of knowledge made that possible? That is where the next part begins. If structures reflect systems, then systems reflect knowledge. And that is where the conversation becomes more challenging. Because when we examine early Egypt closely, we do not just see impressive outcomes. We see consistency. And consistency is rarely accidental. In most historical contexts, knowledge develops visibly through stages. Early attempts are uneven. Techniques vary from one generation to the next. Errors are common, and improvement is gradual. This process usually leaves behind a learning curve, a visible trail of experimentation. But in early Egypt, that trail is surprisingly difficult to trace. Certain forms of knowledge appear already stable by the time they enter the archaeological record. Not perfect, but repeatable. Geometry applied at scale. Architectural alignment maintained across projects. Medical practices that extend beyond emergency survival. Astronomical observation tied to long-term cycles. None of these are impossible on their own. What draws attention is their organization. They do not appear as isolated flashes of insight. They appear as systems. And systems require time. They require training, transmission, correction, and shared understanding. This raises a careful question. Where is the visible learning curve? Not because it must exist in stone, but because knowledge rarely arrives fully structured without a period of refinement. It is important to pause here and clarify a boundary. We are not suggesting lost civilizations. We are not proposing secret sciences. And we are not denying human development. What we are acknowledging is that knowledge can circulate long before it is formalized. Long before it is monumental. Long before it leaves durable traces. In societies where knowledge is transmitted orally, through apprenticeship, or through repeated practice rather than text, the learning curve may not fossilize clearly. By the time it appears in stone, it may already be mature. This possibility is not speculative. It is widely recognized across anthropology. Skills often stabilize in practice before they are documented in record. What makes Egypt distinctive is how early that stabilization appears to occur relative to its preserved monuments. Consider architectural alignment. Consistent orientation toward cardinal directions appears across early monumental projects, even when such precision was not structurally required. This kind of alignment reflects shared conventions rather than isolated ingenuity. It suggests knowledge that had already stabilized before it became monumental. The same pattern appears in proportional systems, standardized block dimensions, and repeating construction rhythms. These are not signs of trial and error. They are signs of institutional knowledge, knowledge that is taught, not rediscovered each generation. Which brings us back to transmission. If these methods were understood early, they had to be learned somewhere. They had to be practiced repeatedly, corrected, and passed on. But the mechanisms of that transmission do not leave obvious archaeological signatures. Schools made of organic materials vanish. Training spaces are reused. Early tools are replaced. What remains are the results. And results can be misleading. Because results compress time. They make development appear sudden, when in reality it may have been long and quiet. This is why Egypt often feels like an exception. Not because it breaks the rules of history, but because it compresses visibility. The learning curve may not be missing. It may be hidden in forms we are not well equipped to detect. And this brings us to a broader realization. Knowledge does not require monuments to exist. It requires continuity. And Egypt had that in abundance. Stable geography, predictable cycles, strong incentives to preserve what worked. In such an environment, once a system proved effective, it could be maintained for generations without dramatic modification. That stability reduces visible innovation, not because innovation stopped, but because it was no longer necessary. This challenges a common assumption. We often equate progress with visible change. But in many systems, the most advanced stage is the one that changes least, because it has already converged on something efficient. Seen this way, early Egyptian knowledge does not appear premature. It appears conserved. And conservation can look like mystery when we expect escalation. This reframing matters. Because it shifts the question from how the knowledge appeared to why it was preserved the way it was, and why, in later periods, some of it was simplified, adapted, or redirected. Those choices were not signs of decline. They were responses to changing contexts. Which means the real story is not about lost ability. It is about changing priorities. And that brings us naturally to the final stage of the discussion. Because once we recognize that systems shape structures, and knowledge shapes systems, we are left with one last question. What happens when the context itself changes? That is where the next part begins. When we talk about ancient Egypt, it is impossible to ignore one subject. Not because it is mysterious, not because it is religious, but because of how specific it is. The Egyptian vision of the afterlife is not vague. It is not symbolic in a loose sense. And it is not emotionally abstract. It is structured, described in stages, governed by rules, mapped with consequences. In many cultures, the afterlife is imagined as a continuation of hope, fear, or moral intuition. In Egypt, it is organized like a system. The dead do not simply arrive. They proceed. They are tested, judged, verified. There are gates, questions, declarations, and failure is possible. This level of detail is unusual. not because belief itself is unusual, but because precision at this scale suggests something more than imagination. It suggests internal logic. One well-known example illustrates this clearly. The heart of the deceased is weighed against the feather of Ma'at, not as symbolism alone, but as a procedural judgment. Truth is measured, balance is required, and the outcome determines continuation or loss. This is not a metaphor left open to interpretation. It is a rule. The Egyptian afterlife functions less like a myth, and more like a framework. A framework that assumes familiarity. That assumes the listener already understands the rules. Which raises an important question. Why would a society invest so much effort into defining a world no one could confirm? One answer is psychological comfort. Another is social control. But neither fully explains the consistency. Across centuries, across dynasties, across changes in political power, the core structure remains recognizable. The language shifts. The iconography evolves. But the logic holds. This suggests continuity. And continuity implies transmission. The knowledge of the afterlife was not reinvented each generation. It was taught, memorized, copied, preserved. The texts themselves tell us this. Instructions are sequential. Errors are warned against. Deviations are corrected. These are not poetic flourishes. They are procedural. What makes this more striking is how early this level of organization appears. The earliest funerary texts already assume a system in place. They do not explain the logic from scratch. They reference it. Once again, we encounter the same pattern. Knowledge appears organized. At the moment it becomes visible. Not chaotic. Not experimental. But stable. This does not mean the Egyptians knew the afterlife in a literal sense. And it does not imply hidden access to truth. It suggests something more subtle. That systems of belief, like systems of construction, can mature quietly over long periods before being formalized. By the time they reach stone and papyrus, they may already be refined. The afterlife, in this sense, functions less as a destination and more as a mirror. It reflects how Egyptians understood order, balance, responsibility. The same principles that governed land, labor, and kingship appear again beyond death. Ma'at does not stop at life. It continues. This consistency matters because it tells us that Egyptian belief was not separate from Egyptian knowledge. Religion was not an escape from reality. It was an extension of it, which challenges a modern assumption. We often separate belief from rational systems. We imagine religion as emotion and administration as logic. Egypt did not make that distinction. Order applied everywhere. In fields, in courts, in temples, and beyond life itself. And this leads to a more direct question. What kind of society organizes its vision of the afterlife with the same discipline it uses to manage land, labor, and law? What does that say about how it understood responsibility? Not after death, but during life? That question does not invite mystery. It invites comparison. And it prepares us for the final stage. Because once we understand what the Egyptians preserved, what they standardized, and what they carried across generations, we are left with one last task: to ask what still resists explanation. And why. That is where the final part begins. By this point, we have not uncovered secrets. We have not overturned history. And we have not replaced explanation with mystery. What we have done is slowed down. And in doing so, we begin to notice something important. Ancient Egypt does not challenge us because it lacks evidence. It challenges us because some of its evidence does not behave the way we expect historical development to behave. We are used to progress leaving noise behind. False starts, visible mistakes, clear learning curves. We expect early knowledge to announce itself loudly. But Egypt often speaks more quietly. Its systems appear already working. By the time we can see them, its structures feel confident, its beliefs coherent, its administration stable. This does not mean that Egypt emerged fully formed. And it does not mean that anything is being hidden. It means something subtler. Visibility is not the same as origin. Much of what we know about the past depends not on what existed, but on what survived. And survival is selective. Stone survives. Processes do not. Monuments remain. Transmission disappears. Finished systems endure. Early negotiations vanish. This is not a failure of archaeology. It is its condition. Archaeology excels at identifying outcomes. It struggles with pathways. And Egypt magnifies that struggle. Because Egypt did not repeatedly collapse and reset. It continued. Land was reused. Institutions were maintained. Knowledge was preserved through repetition, not reinvention. This continuity had a cost. It absorbed early experimentation. It refined it. And then it erased it as a separate phase. What worked was kept. What did not left little trace. That is why certain questions remain open. Not unanswered, but open. How were complex systems taught before they were formalized? How long did practices stabilize before they appeared in stone? What kinds of learning leave no durable signature at all? These are not fringe questions. They are discussed carefully within academic research, often quietly, often cautiously, because the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it is also not permission to invent explanations. So we remain in between confidence and humility, between knowledge and restraint. This is where responsible history lives. It does not rush to fill gaps. It resists turning silence into spectacle. Instead, it listens. And when we listen to Egypt carefully, we hear something consistent. Not mystery, not impossibility, but continuity, order, transmission, preservation. The same principles govern land and labor, belief and governance, life and death. Without contradiction, Egypt did not separate how it built from how it believed. It did not divide rational systems from symbolic ones. For Egypt, order was not a category. It was a condition. And that condition shaped everything. This single idea reframes the entire discussion. The question is no longer, how did they do this so early? It becomes, what kind of society values continuity as much as innovation? What kind of culture designs knowledge to endure, not to escalate endlessly? These are quieter questions. They do not produce dramatic answers. but they produce understanding. And understanding is slower than mystery. This is why Egypt resists closure. Not because it is unknowable, but because it asks us to change how we measure intelligence. We often associate advancement with novelty. Egypt reminds us that endurance is also sophistication, that maintaining what works can require as much knowledge as inventing something new, and that sometimes the highest level of mastery is knowing when not to change. What remains unanswered is not a secret. It is a context shaped by geography, by continuity, by values that favored balance. Over disruption, this is not an invitation to doubt history. It is an invitation to respect it. Because history is not weakened by unanswered questions. It is strengthened by them. They remind us that the past was lived, not designed for our understanding. And Egypt, perhaps more than any other civilization, teaches us this lesson: that knowledge can be ancient without being obvious, that systems can be advanced without being loud, and that some of the most important chapters of human development were written in ways we are still learning how to read. This does not end the conversation. It refines it. And refinement, like knowledge itself, takes time. That is why Egypt still matters. Not because it defies explanation, but because it demands patience.